Week 4 of the fantasy football season. Here's the top 36 running backs. I'm ranking this week number 1, Saquon Barkley of the Philadelphia Eagles. So this week, a great matchup with Tampa Bay Buccaneers. Last week, they gave up a lot of yards on the ground. And Saquon Barkley this season having another monster season in his first year with this Philadelphia Eagle team. I know now Devonta Smith possibly out as well. We know A.J. Brown most likely not playing this week. But Saquon Barkley in between the tackles, he's a great running back. He's got that burst. He's got that breakout speed. And this week, he's number 1. Number 2, Breece Hall of the New York Jets. Breece Hall, he's been a PPR machine. A lot of nice dump-offs out of the backfield. In between the tackles, a physical runner. I know Brandon Allen's starting to get some work as well for this New York Jet team. But this Jet team, they're going to run the football a whole lot. They got a good defense, obviously. And this week versus the Denver Broncos, I think Hall has another big game. Out number 3, Alvin Kamara of the New Orleans Saints. So what a resurgent season it's been for Alvin Kamara, where a lot of people wrote him off going into the year, including myself. I thought the numbers would decline. He's got a lot of wear and tear on his body and a smaller back to run in between the tackles. But Kamara, so far the first 3 weeks of the season, he's gone out there and he's been one of the best running backs up there with Breece Hall and Saquon Barkley. And this week in a matchup at the Atlanta Falcons, a team he's got a great track record against throughout his NFL career, playing them twice a season. I like Kamara going out there with a big one once again for Bijan Robinson of the Falcons staying in the same game. So Bijan, he hasn't had that patented breakout game yet, but he's just a solid running back that's going to get minimum 15, 18 points a game. And this week with a decent matchup versus the New Orleans Saints, where Saquon Barkley have a monster game versus in week 3. I think Robinson could have his best game of the year so far this week. Number 5, Kyren Williams of the Los Angeles Rams. Kyren Williams, he's matchup proof. We saw it last season. He was the league winner for 25% of the fantasy players last season. And last week we saw a monster game in a matchup where your 2 top receivers are out in Cooper Kupp and Puka Nacua, where San Francisco was trying to stop the run in that whole ball game. Kyren Williams still went out there and had the hat trick, finding the end zone 3 times, 30 fantasy points in PPR leagues. And this week, even in a tough matchup at the Bears, I'm not worried about it. I think he goes out there and has another great game. Number 6, James Cook of the Buffalo Bills. Every week, James Cook, he's finding the end zone. He's catching a few passes out of the backfield, and he fits this offense like a glove for this Buffalo Bill team. So this week, in a potential shootout at the Baltimore Ravens on Sunday Night Football, this offense has been a well-oiled machine the first 3 weeks of the season. And I think Cook goes out there once again, has a great game. Number 7, Jordan Mason of the San Francisco 49ers. So Christian McCaffrey, who knows when he's going to come back now, getting a procedure and most likely stem cells it's going to be to try to heal quicker and come back. And sometimes those things don't work. So Jordan Mason, I believe minimum another month, he's going to be the starting back. And obviously he's going to get a full workload for the San Francisco 49er team. So last week, a little bit of a down game after 2 great games in the first 2 weeks. But this week, a good matchup versus the Patriots, where the New York Jets ran wild versus them last week. And I think Mason has a big performance this week. Number 8, Jahmyr Gibbs of the Detroit Lions. So this week, a good matchup versus the Seattle Seahawks coming to town. Jahmyr Gibbs, weekly, 15 points a game. It's been for him a minimum in the early going this season. But we're waiting for that patented Jahmyr Gibbs game where he really has a breakout performance. But David Montgomery and Gibbs, the running back tandem on the same team, I believe, this season. And Gibbs every week, he's got that potential to have a monster game every week. And like I said, he's at 15 points per game in the early going. Number 9, Joe Mixon of the Houston Texans. So I don't know if Joe Mixon's going to play in this game, but I'm putting him on the list where there's a chance for him to play. I know he missed last week's game, and maybe Houston figured they don't want to travel with Mixon, give him the week off, and now back home to Houston versus division rival the Jaguars. Maybe they figured we'll get Mixon back and we need to win this ball game after getting blown out last week. So Mixon was off to a great start the first 2 weeks of the season, then twisting that ankle, did return in that ball game versus the Bears, but obviously he didn't play last week. So if Mixon's back, he's number 9. And if not, Cam Akers, obviously, he would be a running back in that 27 to 35 range this week. Number 10, Devon Achane of the Miami Dolphins. I've said it, Achane, Tyreek Hill, the only 2 Dolphin players I would have confidence in starting with Tim Boyle or Skylar Thompson at quarterback. So this week, a decent matchup versus the Tennessee Titans. We know they've had trouble versus the run so far this season is this Tennessee Titan team. And I believe this week here, Devon Achane could have a big game once again. Last week it was a down game, but they went into a buzzsaw. Seattle, 12th man, loud noise, 3-0 on the season. and they just couldn't do much. But this week, back home, Miami, they know they got to solidify the run and play good defense in this one. I think Achane gets back on track. Number 11, Derrick Henry of the Baltimore Ravens. What a ball game it was last week. 150 yards, 2 rushing touchdowns versus the Dallas Cowboys. And this week, not a great matchup versus the Buffalo Bills. But if this is going to be a close ball game, Henry's going to get a lot of volume. And so far in the early going, 4 touchdowns in the first 3 games. So Derrick Henry, I don't think he's going to hold up all season with elite numbers, but right now he's one of the best running backs in fantasy football, and you got to respect it at his age, especially when running backs start to fall apart. 30, 31 years old. 12, Jonathan Taylor of the Indianapolis Colts. Taylor so far, it's been a mixed bag of results, but last week he got it back on track. We know he's a speedy running back, one of the better backs in all pro football, and this offense is pretty much about Jonathan Taylor this season. Anthony Richardson, he struggled the last 2 games especially, and this week in a tough matchup versus the Steelers, I think they're going to want to run the football a whole lot, and hopefully their defense comes out and makes plays for them. I think Indianapolis is figuring 13. Aaron Jones of the Minnesota Vikings. So coming into the year, I thought Aaron Jones, his best days were behind him, and still, yes, it is 3 games. Aaron Jones has been injury prone over the last few seasons, but right now he's been a top 10 running back in the early going. And this week, he wants a revenge game at the Green Bay Packers. They cut him loose for Josh Jacobs this offseason, so he signed the 1-year deal with Minnesota. And this Minnesota Viking team playing great so far, 3-0 in the early season. So Aaron Jones, like I said, he's been a top 10 back in the early going this year. I respect it as well. So this week at number 13, 14, Zach Charbonnet of the Seattle Seahawks. Even if Kenneth Walker comes back, I think Zach Charbonnet definitely earned himself a big role in this offense. 2 touchdowns last week, touchdown in week 2 versus New England as well. And this week, a pretty good matchup at the Detroit Lions in a potential shootout. And also Zach Charbonnet, pretty decent pass catcher out of the backfield. So like I said, we'll see if Kenneth Walker returns, but oblique injuries are very shaky, especially in football. You injure that once again, you're out for multiple weeks. And with Charbonnet playing well and the Seattle team 3-0, I think once again Walker's going to sit out on Monday night one more week. 15, James Conner of the Arizona Cardinals. So far, 2 good games it's been for Conner. And last week, a middle of the pack ball game. So this week, a good matchup versus the Commanders. We saw Zach Moss run wild versus them in last week's ball game. And Conner could catch the football out of the backfield. Good runner in between the tackles. Trey Benson, he hasn't been a threat to Conner's job this season. I think this week he has a bounce-back performance. 16, Travis Etienne of the Jacksonville Jaguars. He's pretty much the only player producing consistently in the first 3 weeks for this 0-3 Jaguar team. So last week, that ball game was over at halftime. So that ball game you just throw out. And now on to this week at Houston. They're going to want to solidify the run. They want to get things going. They don't want to get in a shootout with the Houston Texans, is this Jacksonville Jaguar team. And Tank Bigsby, he did return in last week's game, but he wasn't a threat at all. I know week 1 he had 12 carries. Last week only 2 carries for Bigsby. So Etienne, he's back as the bell cow. Again, it looks like he's Etienne. And this week, in a decent matchup at Houston, where we saw Jones have a monster game, I think he's a nice RB2. 17, Brian Robinson of the Washington Commanders. So it looks like Austin Eckler is going to be out. He got concussed in Monday night's game at Cincinnati. Brian Robinson, he's been a solid running back since he's been in the league. We know he's a big goal line back, but also he's underrated catching the football out of the backfield as well. So this week in a good matchup at Arizona, where David Montgomery and Jahmyr Gibbs both torched that defense in week 3. I think Robinson is a solid game this week. 18, Josh Jacobs of the Green Bay Packers. So last week, pretty much a 50-50 split. It was with Jacobs and Emmanuel Wilson. Even though I know some of the snaps for Emmanuel Wilson were in garbage time, where they were blowing out the Tennessee Titans, but Jacobs, a physical runner in between the tackles. Week 2, we know he came off a monster workload, 32 carries at Indianapolis. And this week with Jordan Love most likely back in the lineup, things will open up a little bit more, even though this is a very tough matchup versus the Vikings. 19, David Montgomery of the Detroit Lions. Him and Gibbs, the best combo backfield, I believe, in the NFL. And David Montgomery, short yardage guy, goal line guy, going to catch some passes out of the backfield. And this week versus Seattle in a potential shootout, I think he has another good game. 20, Zach Moss of the Cincinnati Bengals. Zach Moss is the running back there in Cincinnati. I know Chase Brown, he looked pretty good with 7 carries, 62 yards and added a few catches in last week's game. But Zach Moss finished with 20 fantasy points in PPR leagues, even though I know that last drive was garbage time. But this week, a great matchup at the Carolina Panthers. More physical in between the tackles, decent receiver out of the backfield. And this week is an RB2 option. I think he's solid. 21, Chuba Hubbard of the Carolina Panthers. So Chuba Hubbard, he had the breakout game last week, and this whole Panther offense changed quickly when you get Andy Dalton in there. When you could get a guy who could actually move the football down the field and make quick decisions, teams could start moving the football and making plays, and that's exactly what happened last week for this Carolina Panther team. Mind, it was the Vegas Raiders, but still they went out there and dominated, and Chuba Hubbard had 21 carries, 114 yards, and 5 catches, 55 yards, a touchdown. I'm not saying he's going to go out there and have a big performance, but he's clearly the number one back till Jonathan Brooks returns off the ACL, which could be in a couple weeks here. And this week versus Cincinnati, this could be a up and down the field type of matchup a little bit. 22, Carson Steele of the Kansas City Chiefs. I know Kareem Hunt, he got elevated to the main roster, but Carson Steele, he looked good last week. He got 18 touches in that ball game. Physical young kid in between the tackles, where he's going to run over linebackers and safeties. The only thing, he's not going to catch the football, where that's Samaje Perine job, but I like Carson Steele, and he does remind me a little bit of Isaiah Pacheco, that physical runner looking for contact. And this week in a decent matchup at the Los Angeles Chargers, where I believe Kansas City will be up early and often. He'll get a lot of opportunity. 23, Devin Singletary of the New York Giants. And Devin Singletary, he's been solid so far in the early going. This week, a great matchup versus the Dallas Cowboys. They're the worst team versus the run this season. We saw Henry last week go over 150 yards on the ground versus the Dallas Cowboys. And we saw Alvin Kamara score 4 touchdowns versus the Cowboys in week 2. So Singletary in a good spot this week. I think he could carve out decent numbers once again. 24, J.K. Dobbins of the Los Angeles Chargers. So Gus Edwards, he's not really looking like a factor in that backfield. J.K. Dobbins, the first 2 weeks, over 130 yards in each game. Week 1 at Vegas, went over 130. Then week 2 at the Carolina Panthers, went over 130. And last week he was bottled up. And this week it definitely could be tough sledding versus the Kansas City Chiefs, one of the better defenses in all pro football. But J.K. Dobbins is going to get the work, I believe. And if the game script goes like I believe it will, where they're trailing early and often, we know Dobbins is the passing downs running back, and Edwards is nothing more than goal line and short yardage. 25, Tony Pollard of the Tennessee Titans. Tony Pollard, it's been up and down so far the first 3 weeks. And this week, it's a decent matchup on Monday night at the Miami Dolphins. But last week, he was bottled up versus the Green Bay Packers. And this week, we'll see what happens once again, because the blueprint's out there. Try to stop the run early, get off to a lead, and then make Will Levis try to beat you. And that's been the blueprint for these teams versus Tennessee so far. And if Miami could get off to a lead with Boyle or Thompson at quarterback, I believe we could see the same. But Tony Pollard is a flex option. I still believe help fantasy owners this week. 26, Najee Harris of the Pittsburgh Steelers. Last week it was a tale of 2 halves for Harris. The first half, he did nothing. And then second half, he rushed over 75 yards in the victory versus the Los Angeles Chargers. This week, another tough matchup at Indianapolis, where they're a better defense at home on the road. And last week they bottled up the run game for the Chicago Bears with his Colt defense, where I believe they're going to want to see Justin Fields try to throw the football and beat them, and that's going to be the game plan for Indianapolis. But Najee Harris as a flex or a back-end 2 option weekly, I don't think it's the worst thing right now. 27, Ramondre Stevenson of the New England Patriots. Last week it was a horrible game for Stevenson. He had only 23 yards on the ground and a fumble, ending with 0.3 fantasy points. And this week, another tough matchup at the San Francisco 49ers, where most likely New England's going to be trailing early in this one. They're going to abandon the run, even though I know Stevenson's a pretty good receiver out of the backfield. Antonio Gibson does that maybe a little bit better. So the way this game script might go, Stevenson's workload might get cut in half in this ball game. This week, 28, Jerome Ford of the Cleveland Browns. So this backfield, every week, it's a mystery who's going to get the most touches. Week 2, it was Foreman getting 15 touches. And then last week, Foreman wasn't a factor. And obviously, I know that if they're trailing early and often, Ford's going to stay in there because Foreman does nothing catching the football out of the backfield. So this week in a pretty good matchup in a game that I believe should be close between these two teams. I think Ford at Vegas is a back-end option. 29, Rachaad White of the Tampa Bay Buccaneers. So Rachaad White quickly falling down the rankings in the first 3 weeks. His yards per carry is the worst. He's starting running back in the league this season, under 3 yards per carry. And this week, it's a tougher matchup versus Philadelphia. For the most part, they're one of the better run-stopping defenses in the league, and they had tough matchups the last couple weeks. Week 2, Bijan came to town. They didn't do a great job versus him, but he didn't really break out. And even Kamara, for the most part, in that ball game last week, they limited him with his Philly defense. So this week in a tough matchup versus Philly, and where if he's not catching the football out of the backfield, he's not going to be a factor. And also Bucky Irving is going to get more work. Head coach Todd Bowles said number 30, Braylon Allen of the New York Jets, a big physical running back. Last couple weeks now, he's starting to get legit backup work. And I think Allen, he only needs anywhere from 8 to 12 touches to be a flex option. So this week versus the Broncos, who's a pretty stout defense for the most part, we'll see what Allen could do. But like I said, he was a guy who wasn't on the radar the first week. And now the last 2 weeks, he's been on the radar. And if anything ever happened to Hall going out with injury, Braylon Allen, to me, he's a top 10 running back, 12 running back weekly, 31 Bucky Irving of the Tampa Bay Buccaneers. So Bucky Irving, the last couple weeks, he's really putting heat on that starting job for Rachaad White, where this could be a full-blown 50-50 split. I could see with Irvin being the in-between the tackles guy, and he could catch the football out of the backfield as well, where Rachaad White's more the receiving back. And we know the last couple seasons he's put up big receiving numbers out of the backfield is White. But this week, if you need a deep flex, I think Bucky Irving could be a decent option. 32, Rico Dowdle of the Dallas Cowboys. He looks like the running back to own over there in Dallas, even though it's been pedestrian numbers the first few weeks of the season for Dowdle. But this week, could this be a ball game where the Cowboys actually leading and they could run the football instead of Dak dropping back 45, 50 times and throwing it? So Rico Dowdle is a low-end option. I think he could be decent for fantasy owners if they're in a pinch and have injuries on their roster. This week, 33, Javonte Williams of the Denver Broncos. So this backfield's a mess. Last week, we saw Jaleel McLaughlin get the goal line stamper, and he scored a touchdown. And we even saw the youngster Tyler Beatty out-touch everyone in the backfield in Williams and McLaughlin. So we don't know what's going on in that backfield. But Javonte Williams still the starter for now. And this week's a tough matchup with the Jets. So if you could avoid Williams, I would this week. 34, DeAndre Swift of the Chicago Bears, another running back I would avoid this week. Swift, he got a nice contract in the offseason, but he really hasn't done anything at all the first 3 weeks of the season. And that has to do with a poor offensive line and Caleb Williams taking some big hits and turning the football over, where the Bears, for the most part, have been trailing the majority of the season. And this week, it's a decent matchup versus the Los Angeles Rams. But I don't have great confidence in Swift. 35, Alexander Mattison of the Vegas Raiders, another backfield where I wouldn't want any part of if I'm a fantasy owner. Zamir White, I thought he would come into the season and be a decent running back in between the tackles. And then Madison coming on passing downs, but White hasn't done anything. And at least Madison, he's found the end zone a couple times this season and can catch the football out of the backfield. So this week in a ball game with two similar teams going at it, I think Madison, if you're desperate, maybe you play him, but I wouldn't have confidence in the 36th and final back I'm ranking Samaje Perine of the Kansas City Chiefs. So Samaje Perine, he's the third down back, change of pace back. I know Kareem Hunt, he got called up to the main roster, but to be honest, I think Kareem Hunt's best days are behind him. Last season, I know he had 9 touchdowns, but he only averaged 3 yards per carry, and Carson Steele, to me, is a more physical running back in between the tackles than Hunt. And Samaje Perine, a better wide receiver out of the backfield. So this week, if you need some help in deeper leagues, I think Perine could carve out maybe a ball game in that 6 to 10 point range. That's the top 36 backs I'm ranking for week 4 of the fantasy football season.